scholar, as I say, from the University of Sussex. He just moved. Congratulations for the new position in Sussex, a very important university. We have a few colleagues in the institute who did their PhD there in political science. So welcome to the institute. And well, let's present a little bit some key facts about his trajectory as a researcher. As I said, he's a principal research fellow at the University of Sussex, United Kingdom, and he is the principal investigator of an international research project sponsored by the European Research Council, Starting Grant. So it's a very important research project entitled Green Industrial Policy in the Age of Raw Metals. Transnational comparison of growth strategies in rare earth mining. He has worked in many universities in the Netherlands, in Japan, among other places, and also he has developed an expertise as a consultant and advisor for various international organizations and resource governance actors. He specialized on clean energy transition and state-owned companies. So, Jojo, the first yours. You have around 40 minutes or so, as you please, and then we will open up the discussion. So please prepare your questions. It's a great opportunity, I repeat, to discuss indeed topics that are in the avant-garde of the research in the international political economy. So please, enjoy it and don't be shy to ask heterodox questions to Jojo. It's the real opportunity for doing so. Thank you very much. You can sit down here or in the podium.
Muchas gracias por la oportunidad para presentar mi libro aquí. Pero me permite que hable en inglés porque no, la verdad es que no hablé en español en un espacio profesional. Entonces, lo siento por eso. Okay. So, this is a book that started many years ago, specifically 2008. I was in Chile in 2009 to do the field work here in Santiago, in Antofagasta, in Calama. And the book eventually became a comparison of natural resource-based public enterprises. So that's the case, Petrobras and Codelco. And what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the kind of questions that I raised in the book, why I think they're important questions, and then what my strategy was to answer those questions. Then what I will do is to give you, because I don't think I know more than you about Codelco, but what I will do is to give you a sense of the comparison of the book, of the case studies. What do we learn from public enterprises in the mining and oil and gas industry? And then I'm going to talk about the significance of thinking theoretically. I will be quite academic on this in terms of how we conceptualize public ownership and the significance of public ownership in debates on economic development. So, the book is structured in 3 parts. Very straightforward. The first part provides an overview of why natural resource states have had difficulty in promoting economic development, and in particular industrial development, which I will go in a bit. The book offers a theory that is based on history and institutions and politics, and then it gives you a very detailed story about how public enterprises emerged in Latin America, and in particular in Brazil and in Chile. The second part is the sort of the meat of the analysis. The book is a 2-country, 2-sector comparison. It compares Chile's mining regulatory framework with Brazil's oil regulatory framework, and how SOEs, how public enterprises, SOEs, state-owned enterprises, how they fit in this regulatory framework. The second chapter for each country case is focused specifically on the company and the challenges that the company had to face and how they responded to these different challenges. And then part 3 brings these two countries, two sectors, two state enterprises together into a comparison. And I talk about the importance of thinking about public ownership in extractive industry, but more generally public ownership in political economy. And then the final chapter talks about the future of resource sector, but in particular, I bring back some of the interesting, what I think is interesting, the conversation on how we think we are now coming to an end of an era, the end of the Washington Consensus, the post-Washington Consensus, post-neoliberalism. But what does that mean for natural resource states in the region? So, let me start by making a point about the importance of mineral states. And this is the first part of the first couple of pages of the book. I basically make a claim that renewable energy systems are changing because of clean energy transition, because of strategic competition as well. And this transformation is very mineral intensive. And therefore, it's really important to think about what mineral states do in order for us to have a better understanding of the complexity of our energy transition. In this energy transition, China, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa will play a very important role as producers. But what we need to understand is the domestic politics of these mineral states. And in particular, I would argue that public enterprises are oftentimes neglected, ignored, or outright dismissed as agents of development. So the book makes a claim that if we want to think about energy transition, if we want to think about the future, we need to go back to the significance of state ownership in key industries. Now, the literature that was developed between the 1980s all the way to early 2000 focused on the inevitability of economic globalization. We came at a point with this idea that there is nothing reversible. Supply chains will be globalized, markets will remain as the dominant player in the market, and that they are superior in terms of delivering economic development for the global south. What is important in this assumption is that there is a trade-off between economic globalization and state agency, meaning states are not able to exercise their ability to shape their future because of the inevitability of globalization. Now, what the book does is to say there is an alternative phenomenon that we could observe between the 1980s all the way to 2020, which is the consolidation of a growth strategy that is centered around the existence and the thriving presence of state-owned enterprises, particularly in highly strategic industries such as natural resources. Despite this empirical fact, we often associate state ownership and public ownership, in particular, between the 1980s to 2000, to rent-seeking, to corruption, myopic decision-making. So in fact, we think state ownership is bad because the historical evidence appears to be that they don't deliver economic development. Now, that is actually not the case if we broaden the comparison, not just across Latin America, but also if we embrace the experiences, the historical and comparative evidence that you can find in other regions, in particular in East Asia. So my training is, I studied developmental states and industrial policy in Asia and Latin America. So I come from a view that you could find meaningful comparisons between these regions if we think hard about what are the commonalities and differences between these two regions. And in particular, I think what has been often dismissed is the role of public enterprises, both in East Asia and in Latin America. And if we want to think about the future, we need to think about state ownership differently. So my claim is that there are different types of public ownership, and in the context of post-liberalization, there are different ways in which public enterprises can become competitive. So the book then outlines three key questions. The first question is, why is it that public enterprises are often subject to state intervention? So if we agree with the principle of neoliberalism, that markets are superior, that we should let go of state enterprises, why is it that, public enterprises are actually subject to politicization by the state? So in both cases of Brazil and Chile, public enterprises were routinely subject to political interference by the national government, or at least there's an attempt to do so. Second, if we accept the presumption that public enterprises are conduits of corruption and they're vessels of rent-seeking, why not privatize them? Why has it been so difficult to privatize Codelco and Petrobras? And then finally, if then the public and national government, society more generally, decides that we don't want to privatize these companies, are there alternative strategies? What are these strategies that we can implement to make these public enterprises more efficient, more effective, more globally competitive? And does that have something to do with the fact that they are operating in politically sensitive and economically strategic industries? So the book makes one major claim, which is that historically, we assume that if you have natural resources, it's very hard to industrialize and that economic development is hard to achieve. The book challenges the so-called resource curse thesis. So every mining country, every university has taught the resource curse, the Dutch disease. So I'm not going to get into that. But my book, what it does is it takes two important case studies in Latin America in which there are industries, there are sectors, there are firms, and there are centralized states in which they've managed to overcome some aspects of the resource curse. Not all, but some of it. Principally, the idea that you cannot build strong states and strong developmental institutions if you are based on natural resources. The second challenge that I pose in the literature is that most of the time, we think natural resources should be managed by the private sector, by multinational companies. So what I did is I took two state enterprises that have been apparently thriving in the resource sector, and I argued that they actually played a very important role in the country's history of economic development. So either through sectoral promotion or simply by becoming effective and efficient public enterprises. So what the book does is it makes a claim that we need to cast the net much wider. We need a better framework of analysis to understand the political economy of mineral states. And in particular, my book makes a claim that we often pay attention to state-business relations, but we don't pay attention to the internal dynamics of the state, the relationship between the state and the public enterprises. So this is in the book what I call state-state relations. The empirical novelty of the book starts with, and my claim is that if you remember from 2000 to 2014, this was the big commodity boom. This was the moment when prices were very high, the export bonanza in Latin America. Everyone studied Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, resource nationalization, the dramatic change, the radical change in Latin America, the return of the left in the region. So what I did is I said, why don't we look at two countries that did not make any changes during that particular time period? And that's the case of Brazil and Chile. Rather than dramatic political changes, what you actually found is a long process of institutional stability and very, very incremental changes. So what I argue is, these are two important cases where there's continuity in economic policies for 3 decades, and that needs to be explained. If the theory says resources generate radical change, why is it that it did not happen in these two countries? More importantly, although these are two common cases where there's a lot of institutional continuity, they're actually very, very different. Codelco functions in a very neoliberal, very market-based political economy, whereas Brazil's Petrobras operates in a very interventionist developmentalist political economy model. So my argument is that these companies had to find a way to embed themselves in the political economy systems of their respective country context in order for them to thrive and to sustain themselves and not be privatized. The implication is that public enterprises actually have very different functions depending on the political context. But we cannot understand these different political functions unless we take them as historically constituted processes rather than an outcome of rational choice. So this is a book that is very much a political science book, as you can see. And it's very much a challenge to the idea that everything is based on rational calculation of actors. So I'm very partial to a historical institutionalist approach to understanding economic development. And that's why the framework in the book that I developed is called historical institutionalism. It allows us to trace the exercise of state agency amidst economic globalization. Again, going back to the idea that globalization was an inevitable force and process that cannot be reversed. My argument is that the state agency, the exercise, the actual existence of these public enterprises challenge the very foundations of how we understand the logic of economic globalization. And in particular, there are two aspects as to why public enterprises have been kept in these economies despite pressure to liberalize and to privatize. The first is that actually historical antecedents matter, meaning the long durée process of historical accumulation of state capacity, the consensus building around the need for a public enterprise was an important obstacle and a challenge to privatize these companies. So political elites have chosen to maintain public enterprises as opposed to directly privatizing these sectors. And again, this is an argument that speaks more broadly to the Latin American political economy debate, in which we make the assumption that because there's privatization, because markets are more superior than states, we need and we should privatize these public enterprises. So it's an attempt to explain why they have not been privatized. The second aspect of historical institutionalism, I argue, is that the mere presence of these well-managed public enterprises means that the states could alter the logic of state action, meaning the state can redefine the purpose, the public purpose of these companies, and then align them to a much broader developmental function. In particular, the challenge was to create a balance between public and private sector participation in the industry. And so the presence of these companies actually changed the perspective of the post-dictatorial governments in Brazil and Chile. That no matter how strong the pressure for privatization was, it was very important to keep a consensus around the need to have public enterprises as actors of development themselves. So again, it's a play. It's a way to go back to the question of agency that in some instances, Latin American states don't only react to external circumstances. They don't only react to globalization. In fact, they shape actively the political processes of globalization. Now, the project basically presents a very complex theory, which I'm not going to go into in this lecture, around the question of stability and change. Because for me, what was interesting is everyone was talking about radical political change, the left turn in Latin America. To me, what was left unexplained was that some countries decided not to renationalize because there was actually no need for that. In fact, what they needed to do was to strengthen public enterprises, to assert growth and increase and strengthen political control over this resource sector. This is what I call the hybrid strategy, the construction of a political response to globalization in which the state takes two important elements. On the one hand, it tries to embrace private enterprises, meaning attract foreign investment, embrace joint ventures. So as a regulatory framework, we accept participation of the private sector, multinational companies. But then on the other hand, rather than privatizing the companies themselves, the state actually kept to maintain them as competitive counterparts of the private sector. So it's hybrid because there is a market mechanism in place, promoting FDI, but there's also a state mechanism, which is we want to keep these public enterprises and we want them to become more competitive and maintain them alongside the private sector. So the outcome is you have two types of development strategies. On the one hand, you have the case of Brazil, in which the state kept Petrobras, an internationally competitive company, despite the tendency for Brazil to increase state intervention. And then in the case of Chile, despite the government wanting to privatize the political economy, they actually kept and maintained the public enterprise Codelco as a way to counterbalance the exigencies of the market. So these two countries combined creates a third way strategy. So we're not just choosing between the public and the private. We're actually choosing a middle ground here in which the public and the private can coexist. Now, what is the logic of keeping state ownership in strategic resource industries? The logic is, if you can create an industrial ecosystem in which public enterprises can become internationally competitive, they can perform vis-a-vis the private sector, you actually create new functions for the state company. It can promote technological innovation, it can support industrial policy, it enables the state company to rethink its role in the political system. The second is, I argue that theoretically, we often assume that public enterprises are simply reactions from the state. Whereas in fact, if we historicize the development of public enterprises, if we look at the long durée creation of public enterprises, we can then have a better and a different understanding of the role of SOEs. SOEs become historically constituted actors of economic development. Now, the main focus of the book is basically to look at the relationship between the state and the public enterprises as they become embedded in different logics of political action. And then the second important element of the book is that I'm trying to go beyond the assumption that public enterprises only exist in the oil and gas sector. So in the oil and gas, it's very common to have national oil companies. As you know, what are the biggest national oil companies? You have Statoil, you have the Middle Eastern countries, Pemex, PDVSA in Venezuela. So the book makes a very clear attempt to get out of the idea that public enterprises can only exist in the oil and gas sector, but it can exist across mining and oil and gas industry. Now, I'm not going to get into detail in terms of the regulatory frameworks and the changes. But the main point I want to make here is there is a two-step process that happened in Brazil and Chile. The first step is there was a moment in which public enterprises were considered to be actors of economic development, but then that has changed as neoliberal reforms were introduced. In Chile, that was in 1973. In the case of Brazil, that was around 1984, 85, 86. But what happened was there was a major period of institutional transformation in which external factors and internal factors combined to create a hybrid model that I was talking about. It's hybrid because there was an embrace of market reforms, meaning we want more FDI, we want more space for the private sector, and most importantly, private companies are legitimate actors of development. But at the same time, there was a moment in which these drivers of institutional change became part of the political system, therefore creating an institutional stability. So the theory essentially makes a case that if we understand regulatory frameworks, the evolution of mining codes and all of that, what you will find is a balancing force between dynamics of institutional change and dynamics of institutional stability. What you have is a convergence towards a public enterprise growth strategy embedded in very different logics of state action. In the case of Chile, you have a public enterprise embedded in neoliberalism, in the case of Brazil, you have a public enterprise embedded in a developmentalist logic of state action. Now, there's two important points that I want to highlight here. The first is, in the literature, we often assume the most important relationship is state and business, which is of course the case if you're studying manufacturing, textile, industries. My argument is, in highly strategic industries in which the state has very clear objective of asserting its political authority, state enterprises are, agents themselves, and that they are agencies that shape the political processes that are unfolding. So the reforms that were undertaken in Brazil and in Chile were intentional. The fact that Petrobras and Codelco coexisted with the private sector is not an accident. That's the whole point here. The logic of state action is such that the state intentionally creates and supports public enterprises because they know that they play a very strategic role. Why is that? This is the second point here. Public enterprises, state-owned companies, we often think have to perform like the private sector, right? We often think of them as they have to be competitive. But actually, people forget that public enterprises are also political actors themselves. Why? Because they're ultimately owned by the state, they are accountable to the public, and therefore, they always have to struggle with two things: the balancing between the public and private role, and importantly, promoting social and state objectives, state-sanctioned objectives, and performing corporate functions, meaning they have to be profitable. If they're not profitable, you get rid of them. So what you have is a political role for these public enterprises. And I think it's a mistake to assume that public enterprises are supposed to behave like the private sector. More importantly, I think it's a mistake to judge public enterprises solely on private sector metrics of development. We cannot judge them in terms of efficiency alone because they have political functions. They have historically embedded themselves in political systems, and they make the regulatory frameworks behave differently because of that. Now, what I do in the book is I emphasize three functions of state companies. And these three roles, I think, is a very important metric of success. Because ultimately, what the public would ask you is, why do we need Codelco? Why do we need Petrobras? If they're not, subject to certain criteria of evaluation, then we don't know why we're keeping them. So what the book tries to do is to say, why don't we have three metrics of success and see whether these two companies can withstand that test? The first is, can they deliver resource strengths? Can they maximize, windfall profits, fiscal resources for the state? Apart from taxation, which is the typical way in which mineral states get money from the resource sector, actually, public enterprises enable direct contribution to the national income of the state. If you look at this, what I will always say is, in fact, Codelco's main contribution is it has always paid more than the private sector in Chile. We always said that Minera Escondida, the legitimacy of Minera Escondida is that they're extremely productive. But the question is, are they extremely productive and do they pay enough for the state? The answer actually is no. Public enterprises have historically provided more resources, mostly because they're efficient. Because you could have a public enterprise in which the money disappears. So part of the argument here is public enterprises that are well managed can actually contribute more to the national treasury. The second point is, by maximizing resource runs, it also enables the public enterprise to produce at par with the private sector. And I think one of the most important indicator of success for Codelco in particular is that it was able to move beyond the 4 mines that it was given and then expanded its productive capacity beyond these sectors. So what's really important to remember is when a public enterprise gets mineral reserves, they often just rely on the quality of the reserve. So if you have very high quality reserves, there's no incentive for you to become a dynamic company. And so what's interesting over the years with Petrobras and Codelco in its existence is that it actually built productive capacity over the years. It was able to expand its mining operations. It was able to move from extracting ore to refining and smeltering. It was able to do all these things that we think private sector companies are able to do vis-a-vis the public enterprise. The second measurement or criteria is the extent to which you can create vertical integration and technological innovation. In the case of Codelco, the technological innovation has to do with specific geological solutions to the problems of copper mining. We often think that we should compare Codelco with like a South African company that operates in platinum. I think that's a really bad comparison because the technological demand to develop efficient mining operations in platinum is very different to the demands of copper mining. So the geological specificity of the mining industry actually requires very high level of technical capacity for the state company. And that is often why we think private enterprises are better, because private enterprises respond more effectively to market signals. So in the book, what I do is to show that actually Codelco and Petrobras were able to respond to market signals in ways that private companies also do. And in the case, if I have to compare Codelco and Petrobras, the Petrobras case is even more successful because what it did is to move from refining and downstream sector to the upstream sector. It's actually the opposite because in the case of Petrobras, they didn't have oil until 2007, but they developed a technology to find oil offshore and then that happened in 2007. So in fact, the company existed for 50 years, becoming profitable, commercially successful internationally, and then developed the upstream sector eventually. By comparison, in the case of Codelco, the company started with nationalizing the resource and then improving the mining operations over the succeeding decades. Finally, it is important to remember that mining and oil and gas, these are enclave economies, meaning it doesn't generate connections to the wider economy automatically. So this is a public policy question. In the case of Petrobras specifically, the state had a very clear plan in terms of promoting sectoral linkages and in particular, obligating oil and gas companies to contribute more on research and development. And that's actually what financed a lot of the technological innovations in the country. I would say that this is the big difference between Codelco and Petrobras. In the case of Chile, there was no clear policy on R&D, and it was very much dependent on public investments, which wasn't significant. There has been a change in that policy, though, through the World Supplier Program that was implemented, I think, after 2010. But this was after 4 decades of existence of the state company. And the rationale behind the new policy actually was that suddenly the Chilean government realized Australia was able to develop mining technologies and Chile could not develop the same mining technology. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that there was no emphasis on the supply side of the industry. So an emphasis on technological innovation, a policy that emphasizes technological innovation was really important, and they had a pilot program that was launched around 2014, 2015. Now, the book opens up the comparison to say that in these 2 cases, you have had fairly relatively successful public enterprises. It's not a claim that they're overall extremely successful. What it's saying is they have played an important role in the long-term development of these industries. Now, what happens though is there are countries that were not able to achieve the same level of export diversification, technological innovation. And I would argue a large part of that had to do with the fact that market reforms were not mediated by a stronger role by the public enterprise. In the case of Peru, for example, Peru has implemented nearly all mineral reforms that you can find in Chile, but because they were very much driven by the private sector and because there was no state authority and weak institutions to manage the resource sector, there was much less outcome, much less developmental impact in terms of the long-term development of its mining industry. The opposite case, of course, is when you have an extremely interventionist state like in Venezuela. The case of Venezuela is particularly instructive because I actually talk about Venezuela from the beginning, from the 1930s, 1940s in the book. Venezuela is interesting because up to the 1980s, it was considered to be the most successful Latin American public enterprise. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that the Venezuelan company, PDVSA, was actually a highly international company, and it was able to promote a lot of joint ventures vis-a-vis major oil companies, and then that changed dramatically because of the political dynamics in the system. And of course, what happened was that the excessive tendency of the Chavez government to embrace control over the company, of the public enterprise, actually reversed the gains of PDVSA. So the main problem of PDVSA by like 2010, 2011 was that it was negatively producing oil, meaning that it was losing oil despite all the things it was trying to take out from the ground. It was actually not making enough money. So part of the structural conditions that created the crisis in Venezuela was, it actually, I would argue, originated from this problem because Venezuela, like Chile, was reliant on a single commodity. And so losing that balance between the state and the public enterprise was extremely damaging for the Venezuelan oil and gas industry. So in conclusion, my argument is we do need to pay attention to state ownership. It is important to remember why public enterprises exist. But we need to remember that these are not rational choices made by political actors. These are not decisions that are free of constraints. And because of that, it's important to remember that state ownership is a function and is directly connected to institution building. The stronger you have your state capacity is, the more likely state ownership can be managed better. Chile and Brazil demonstrate completely different strategies to the other Latin American countries because they managed to successfully combine market mechanisms with the state mechanism. And now, because if you look at the debates in political economy in the world today, we talk about state capitalism as if it's the most natural paradigm. Actually, the state capitalism debates kind of miss out on the fact that in Latin America, there is a strong tradition of developmentalism. There is a strong tradition of public enterprises, but we often take that for granted. And it's really important to have these cases coming from other countries in order for us to have a better understanding of the evolutionary nature of state capitalism that's happening today. So yes, if we think of state capitalism, yes, China is a model of state intervention, but so is Brazil, so is Chile. They're just very different model by comparison to other countries. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jewellord. It was a very informative and enriching presentation. So let's open the discussion with the audience. Anyone wants to go first? Yep.
Thank you. Hi, Julio. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like you to discuss a bit more, or explain a bit further on specifically what is the dependent variable that you're using on this book. And also, it's a very compelling argument. However, it's built upon two very different, though successful cases, in my opinion. You also acknowledge that. What if you consider other cases in the Latin American context where there is strong state institutions with strong state-owned companies, but that are very poorly managed in the case of tenants, for example.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sebastián Neus, Universidad Resultado.
Thank you very much, Sebastián. Maybe we can collect a few more Questions? Yeah.
If you don't mind to answer.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is David. I'm a high school teacher. I want to know if the state-owned enterprises like these two are more or less affected by the variation on the commodity prices as of the private enterprise.
Anyone more?
Thank you for the presentation. Step for the last years. And my question was when you look at resource course that is in Chile and Brazil internationally, the first thing came to my mind is the example of Norway, which when we studied the resource course in university was put forward as the best example how to handle these problems. And I wonder what your opinion about system model of state intervention, I guess, would be in a greater context.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Sorry, I found is there big absent maybe. Maybe you can go ahead, please.
So the main dependent variable of the book is trying to explain the relationship between commodity dependence and industrial development. So that's the basic idea. What it doesn't do, and it did not intend to do, is to formalize that relationship between, it's not an argument necessarily against the resource curse. It does say something about the problems of the resource curse in terms of explaining patterns of industrial development and patterns of export diversification. And so the three main criteria of success for a state company, actually, the main idea behind it is to measure the success in that sense. What the book does, though, in terms of the empirical cases, is to show why certain decisions were made and how the development model emerged. So it is less of an evaluation whether these are successful cases in a using very strict criteria. But it does talk about that, particularly at the beginning and then the end of the book. Pemex, of course, came up in the book multiple times because actually Pemex is the case, and in particular, in the 1930s all the way to the 1960s, when you look at the literature, the creation of public enterprises were mitigated by the fear that they would become Pemex. So the I don't know how to say that, Pemexification of the oil industry. So there was actually a lot of fear that you would create a new Pemex. And that actually was very important in creating the specific political arrangement of the oil and gas industry in Brazil, and also the way state enterprises were built in the mining sector. The question of the management is a different question, I think, because in this particular case, the focus is the management of the companies from the 1980s all the way to early 2020s. So it's a very specific time period, whereas a lot of the conversations and the literature on Pemex is principally connected to the 1930s all the way to the 1980s. So I don't engage in that debate directly. On the question on the relation to commodity prices, I deal with this on the regulatory framework chapters, in the 2 chapters. I don't think public enterprises have the ability to influence commodity prices. Of course, the exception would have been, which never happened, would have been Codelco, because Codelco was producing so much copper for the global economy. But there was a very conscious decision that Codelco would not do that, and in fact would not have a pricing policy. Usually managing commodity prices is a question of, it's a derivative of the cyclical or counter-cyclical policies of the government. And in that case, in the book, I specifically explained that Chile created several sovereign wealth funds in order to counter the commodity price volatility. So in that sense, Chile is an extremely important case of the resource curse in terms of being able to counter price volatility, that it isn't as impacted but as other countries. But also, I think the overall message of the book, if I have to distill it, is the resource curse is true, but it doesn't mean you cannot have economic development. I mean, it doesn't need to be, it's an empirical fact. In Africa, yes, there's a resource curse, but the question of the resource curse cannot be addressed simply by saying that there is a resource curse. So the book is specifically political science in its approach because it's trying to explain how institutions are built to mitigate some of these problems. And of course, in the book, I talk about two problems. One is the resource curse problem, meaning how do you address the resource-specific issues that emerge. But secondly, the economic development problem, meaning you may have a resource dependency, but it doesn't mean you will not have economic development. And so I think that's the point that I was trying to address. On the third and final question on the Dutch disease in Norway, so actually Brazil followed the Norwegian model in the 1990s. They implemented what we call the trilateral system, meaning they created a political system in which there is a regulatory agency, there is a state, a national government, and there's a public enterprise. So this is the Norwegian model. But of course, as with any kind of reforms, it doesn't function the same way as in other countries. You can't transpose it. What is interesting, of course, is the main problem with the oil and gas industry is you may create a regulatory agency, but you may eventually accept that they will not be as powerful. So this idea of check and balance doesn't work. And that is the case for most oil and gas industry, countries with oil and gas. I think what's more interesting, in fact, is there is one country that decided to go completely against that, which is Angola. Angola decided we cannot build strong states, so why pretend? So they just created a state enterprise, and the state enterprise directly intervenes in the oil market. The point I'm making here is, yes, we can talk about good governance and the reforms and models of governance like this, but actually some countries just completely move away from them because it doesn't make sense to have them. And I think what the book is trying to say is, I'm not saying that public enterprises should exist in all places in all times, but my point is, in places that they exist, they've actually delivered some kind of industrial development, some kind of economic development, and that has an important lesson by itself. It's not to say that countries should do it, but that there are lessons to learn from this, especially if you want to build more state enterprises. I mean, I think this is the main thing.
Thank you very much, Jojo. Let's go for the next round of questions. Mr. Pacheco.
Máximo Pacheco, Chairman of Coordinador. Thanks to Jojo for being with us. This is a very important question. You are in the right place, in the right moment, for many of the issues that you've been addressing. And probably the most provocative of all of them is that the title of your book is Business of the State in a country that for at least a couple of decades has been by a group of people saying that the state should not do business. So I strongly believe this is a very important contribution from your side. But in your book, you mentioned that the development strategies are intrinsically hybrid. And you mentioned both Petrobras and now Codelco as companies that are good. They are growing and they are developing through associations and partnerships with private companies. There is a small group of people in Chile who believe that when Codelco starts to associate and develop joint ventures with private companies, this somehow means or could mean that Codelco is being privatized. What would you answer to that group of people?
Thanks a lot. Let's collect one or two more questions.
Hello, congratulations on the release of the book. My name is Ricardo. I'm a PhD student at City University of Hong Kong. I wanted to ask, I noticed you've been using the Brodel term long durée. So I wanted to ask, how do you see these companies in terms of especially the cases you studied, how stable are they when there are regime changes in these countries? Like, do these companies fluctuate in time, and can they be used for the strategies of particular governments, or do they act as agents of stability? Because when you think about industrial policy, you need to have some degree of stability. Thanks.
Thank you, Roberto.
Hello, my name is Camilo. I work here as a coordinator of the Korean Studies program, and I did my PhD at Sussex. Kevin Gray and Ben Selwyn were my supervisors. So, because I have a background and I'm familiar with the concept of the developmental state, but I'm also Latin American, I'm curious about how the concept of the developmental state translates to our context. This is the first time I hear that my country is a developmental state. So how does it translate, and also how that concept travels to Latin America? Congratulations on your book.
Okay. Let me start with Mr. Pacheco's comment on the title, because I actually really thought very hard about the title. I actually consulted 3-4 friends about it, and this is where we all agree that I think the message that the book is trying to convey is that whether you like it or not, in the case of the resource sector at least, the state has a business to it, whether you like it or not. So when states privatize, it is a conscious political decision to privatize. This is not an outcome of some random event. And so the business of the state is about how the state thinks about the sector as a strategic industry. But also that it is the business of the state to think about the value of the resource and assert resource sovereignty. We didn't talk about this in this morning, but in the book, I talk about resource sovereignty quite a lot. I don't say the word resource sovereignty because it kind of gives you it's a very politicized concept, right? Particularly in Latin American debates on extractivism. But the book is very clear that the ownership of resource is the ultimate reflection of state agency and the ability of the state to extend political control over something that historically has been given to the private sector and given to foreign companies in particular. So the title is very strategic in that sense, that I want to say something about why state ownership is really important politically and academically, intellectually in that context. And I think the point on joint ventures, you're definitely right. One of the things that I do, you will find in the chapter on Brazil, I talk specifically about the 4 different types of contracts: joint ventures, production sharing agreements, concession models. The point of that analysis on the legal contractual system, the different system, is that states have a choice. What kind of political contract, what kind of economic contract does the state want with foreign companies? And joint venture is actually one of the most effective way to retain political control in a sector that is predominantly dependent on foreign capital. Because what you do in a joint venture essentially is you're saying, we will allow some shares to be given to the private company, but we're not giving up total political control, total control over, foreign control over the commodity. So it's a way to balance the political demands from the economic demand on how to develop the resource. Because ultimately the point of joint venture and the point of ownership of the resource is that it's supposed to be beneficial more broadly to the national economy. In the case of Brazil, I talked about the shift from a concession grant model to a production sharing arrangement. So this is an important shift in Brazilian ownership structure, because what that meant was Brazil was saying that we are not going to allow the subsoil rights to be owned by foreign companies, which is of course consistent with the Brazilian concept of resource sovereignty. But what we would do is we would allow companies to profit directly by allowing you to invest and then develop the sector, develop the concessions with very limited checks and balances by the national government through Petrobras. So the role of the public enterprise here is not just to take money from the industry. It's actually to maintain control over the long-term development of the reserves. Again, in many countries where there are shifts in contractual agreements, the main problem of the private sector there is that they cannot trust the government. Because basically what you're telling me is today it's a concession grant model, tomorrow it's a production sharing arrangement, the next day it will be 100% owned by the national company. This was exactly the problem that Bolivia had faced. They don't get investments because there's a lack of trust in the investment regime. So in these joint ventures, what actually they do is to send a signal to the market. It's a market signal that we will respect foreign direct investment, that we will respect, and we actually encourage the private sector, the foreign companies, to come into this very risky industry, and we will protect your property rights. And at the same time, we would like to get more as the resource sector is developed. And I think that's a really important distinction. The final point is Codelco is actually very, very special among state enterprises because from the 1990s onwards, there was actually a shift in the corporate governance reform, which is that countries started to separate the ownership and the day-to-day management of the company. Meaning, in the case of Petrobras or in the case of Chinese companies, the state still owns a large part of the company, the shares, but we would allow some kind of private share to come in so that we can finance some of the activities of the company. And at the same time, to indicate that we are trustworthy mineral states, we would allow the day-to-day management of the company to be run by professionals. So there's a separation, there's a legal separation between the ownership of the company, the actual the question of who owns the company, versus who manages the company. In the literature in economics, this is what we call the principal agency problem. So you need to solve the principal agency problem in order to make these companies competitive. And the reason why I say Codelco is extremely interesting is because it did not go through this process, not directly. Codelco remains to be 100% state-owned, meaning it would require a cross-party consensus to change the ownership structure of the company. So there is no way in which you could say, well, this is a company that is giving up the resource of the country. What it did do, however, is it changed by itself, and of course through the legislation, the structure of corporate governance by introducing professionals and technical people into the company to manage it. So over the 3 decades, I think it started in the 1980s as part of the Codelco law, as part of the changes during the political transition, they started reducing the presence of ministers into the board of directors. They also, at the same time, and this is really important that people forget, Codelco kept the union head into the board. What that signals is Codelco is interested in maintaining stable labor relations in the mining industry, in a sector that is historically plagued by labor conflicts. So people often forget that, if you think of the Allende years, Allende fell from power because the labor unions essentially backtracked their support on the state, on the government. And I think that's really important. The management of Codelco is a reflection of the political debates that were taking place in Chile over decades. And the evolution of the corporate governance structure is a reflection of this demand to make the company competitive, but also it's a reflection of the demand for a change in the corporate structure so that it can respond more effectively to the challenges. And I think we can have a conversation on whether that's good or bad, but to me, that's my interpretation of that particular angle on ownership. I talk about the longue durée, and you asked about the question on the the degree to, what is the role of these companies. What separate, and the reason I chose Brazil and Chile as a case study compared to other countries is that these are actually two countries that over a long period of time, if you look at it historically from the 1930s onwards, these are two countries that built an industrial policy, a development policy using a political consensus. So Patricio Silva, who is applied and talked about the breakdown of the political consensus in Chile in the 1960s, 1970s. I agree with him in that sense that Chile actually built developmental state institutions all the way to the 1970s. It did break down at some point, and that explains the coup of the 1973. But there was no breakdown of the political consensus around Codelco. So in fact, I always say, we started with the Chileanization of copper in the 1960s under Frey because the agreement with the Americans failed in 1915. We then decided, then the Chileans decided that Chileanizing, increasing up to 51 to 60% of the ownership isn't enough. So then there was 100% nationalization. But the actual administrative implementation to consolidate Codelco was under Pinochet. And so, in fact, the military government understood the significance of the resource for national development. It also understood that it could not do what Allende did, which is to turn its back away from foreign companies. So part of the reason he came to power was obviously because of the expropriation of the asset. So the mining code was a very deliberate state crafting strategy. It was an attempt to delegitimize the previous government, but it's also an attempt to create a mining investment regime that would allow for the private sector to come in. And so I think that Codelco played a very important role as a political buffer between these very contentious ideological debates in Chile. And consensus building, as historically shown, this is not the first historical, if you look at historical, the political history of Chile, Chile has a long tradition of party politics, it has a tradition of consensus building. All these things are found in the way the mining industry developed its regulatory framework. And that would be my answer to that question on the developmental state. There is several sections in the book that I actually compare the Latin American developmental state with the East Asian. What is missing in the Latin American industrial development strategy vis-a-vis the East Asian state. So I'm not going to get into that, but that is part of what I wanted to convey in the book is there are interesting comparative and historical evidence in Asia and Latin America that we can find if we study them more carefully.
Thanks a lot, Jojo. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. Camila Beltrano from Fundación Mediante. I've been in contact through email and following your work. And regarding what you were speaking about, Codelco, about state ownership, I think there's a really big challenge in studying SOE agency and SOEs that have a majority shares that are state owned, but by very little. Think about Petrobras, YPF, for example, in Argentina. So maybe if you've seen any challenges specifically in studying state-state relationships in SOEs that also have a very big business orientation because the state only owns 51% of the shares. And also how to approach them, because I think there's a gap in the literature there, and maybe we have to start trying to research state ownership a bit more specifically if you identify anything.
Gracias. Any other question? We still have a few minutes. No? So go for it, please.
So I started doing this project around 2008, 2009 when no one wanted to study public enterprises. So I remember this really well. On my first 2 months in Santiago, I was living right across La Moneda. I asked my friend, how do I get close to Codelco? And my friend was like, actually, they will write to you because no one writes about Codelco. And actually, that is how I ended up getting 60 interviews within Codelco, specifically Codelco Andina and Codelco in Calama. I think now, of course, looking back, everyone is saying it's very hard to talk to public enterprise. That actually is true for Petrobras. But that is also a very Brazilian, a very specifically Brazilian problem that in general, in Brazil, you need a very specific political connection to get into certain places. But my experience with studying public enterprises in Asia also and in here is that the companies are interested because they actually want external studies to look into what they're doing. And I think in particular, in my case, what happened was that I was in Santiago for 6 months, and then I had a random email from Codelco Andina saying, we heard there is this PhD student, not even a Latin American at that, who is interested in talking to Codelco. And then through that, I managed to get interviews, and then I went to the north of Chile. So to me, I think part of it is you kind of need to think about methodologically, you have to think about these public enterprises as it's not something that you could study in like 2 to 3 weeks of field work, for example. I do come, my background is development studies. All my projects require at least 6 to 8 months of field work. And I'm pretty sure if you stay in a place and you want to study that place for 6 to 8 months, I truly believe that the doors open for you. And then of course the other thing is in terms of methodological strategy. One thing that has been very useful to me as a strategy is going to the private mining conferences. Because if you keep going to private mining conferences, they will see your face over and over again, and therefore you kind of build the trust over the period of time that you do that. In the project that I'm doing now, which is even more complicated because it's on critical minerals and rare earth and it's subject to strategic competition, I've managed to interview Mitsubishi, Freeport, BHP Billiton also, because I think if you tell them basically that, I think it is a matter of showing that you're a serious scholar to the company. I think what happens is if you sort of approach the company thinking that, oh, I just want to get a one-to-one interview, I think that doesn't work. So to me, that's like studying public enterprises are complicated because think of them, they are political entities as well. You don't go to a politician and ask for an interview. As far as I know, I wouldn't do that. So I think it does require a bit of a methodological reflection in terms of how we can find openings for research.
Thanks a lot, Jojo, for these last remarks about the importance of field work and not just taking public data available on the internet. This is like the real social sciences approach. Sometimes we forget about it when we're just trying to publish papers in global north journals based on data and not based on the real question that we're talking about today and not based on the real field work as the founders of social sciences taught us a long time ago. So let's finish if everything is, if everyone agrees with that. So thank you very much for coming, guys. It was a very interesting and enriching conversation. I hope it will be the first one of many other occasions that we can keep talking about these topics. Jojo he's developing many new research about the green transition and international relations that is relevant for the work we're doing in the Institute. So I really think that we will start to collaborate more and more with he and his colleagues in the UK and in European continental Europe. So thank you very much for coming. Let's give him a last applause.